Peter, James, and Sean, we're gonna crank up. Okay.
We're good.
All right. Friends and neighbors, welcome to this Board of Finance meeting to hear public comment on the model output produced by the Debt Capacity Subcommittee. It's 8 p.m. on Wednesday, February 26, 2025, and I call this meeting to order. I'm Michael Limber, Chairman of the Board of Finance, and with me on stage, raise your hand when I call your name, please, Board Vice Chairman Jeff Farr, and board members Roan Baldwin, Jeff Goldstein, Teresa Brasco, and Chris Bryant. Last April, the Weston Board of Education proposed building a new middle school at a gross cost of $110 million on the assumption that the state of Connecticut would reimburse us 20% of that cost, leaving Weston with the need to finance $88 million. And the Board of Selectmen chose not to advance the construction grant application for this proposal by the June deadline of last year. Around the same time, there was a sentiment expressed at multiple public meetings that there had been no consolidated evaluation of the financial impact of Weston's infrastructure needs, how we could finance it, what would be the tax impact on voters, and to place all of this in the context of a long-term budget analysis. The Debt Capacity Analysis Subcommittee, along with the Debt Management and Available Fund Balance Policy Subcommittees, were created to respond to that sentiment last September. The proposed draft debt management and fund balance policies were presented last month for public comment at a meeting held here at the middle school on January 15th. Tonight's discussion gives us all an opportunity to see how the proposed policy constraints fit into the context of the model output. And after we hear everyone's comments, we will revisit the final adoption of the policies at a Board of Finance meeting shortly after completion of budget season that we will embark on at the end, towards the end of next week. Public participation is an essential element of our democracy. Those who are affected by government decisions have a right to be involved in the decision-making process. And I say this with all sincerity, the public's contribution tonight will have an influence on the Board of Finance's deliberations. And on behalf of the entire Board of Finance, thank you for being here tonight in person and online to share your viewpoints and express your comments. This time I'd like to invite Vice Chair Jeff Farr to offer any preliminary remarks he may wish to convey before we go over the housekeeping matters and get to the presentation and public comment. Jeff?
All right. Thank you, Mike. You stole all my notes. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for coming here this evening to hear, ask questions, and comment on the Board of Finance's debt capacity modeling results. The importance of this modeling effort is to establish some guardrails around the amount of debt the town of Weston can theoretically issue while maintaining a AAA bond rating. It also is also meant to validate the draft debt management policy reviewed with the community on January 15. The timing and costs of the capital projects used in the model were provided by the school and town administrators and are based on preliminary estimates. It bears repeating that no capital request has been submitted to this board. As a point of reference, the town of Weston currently has $5 million in outstanding debt and notes, with another $2.4 million to be issued shortly to complete the 2-year road repaving project. This has been included in the model. Your questions and comments are important to us as the full Board of Finance still needs to deliberate, finalize, and adopt a debt management policy. In that regard, I kindly ask that your questions and comments be delivered in a respectful and civil manner. Outbursts and speaking over others are not acceptable behaviors, and abusers will be asked to leave. Thank you.
Thanks, Jeff. A few housekeeping points about tonight's proceedings. First, we are being simulcast on the town's YouTube channel, and the recording will be available in the next few days for review for those who were not able to attend tonight. Second, we will be observing Robert's Rules of Order. The rules that I'm about to outline for participants are consistent with Robert's Rules Chapter 9, Sections 28 and 29, governing public sessions, as well with the town charter. For members of the Board of Finance and the public at large, you must be recognized by the chair before speaking. 3, the Board of Finance will respond to your questions this evening. You are looking at our work product to date, and we would be happy to explain the background on how the model and the inputs were developed. Please bear in mind that the model and the inputs are not finalized, and that there may be revisions that could materially impact the output that we are discussing here tonight. 4, qualified voters may approach the microphone over there at the podium to address the board. When you hit the microphone and you see the little green light, that means you're live. Qualified voters, as defined in the town charter, means, quote, persons who are eligible to vote at town meetings as determined under the general statutes, unquote. In other words, are you registered and do you live here in Weston? When you approach the microphone and you've been recognized, please announce your full name and street address. That is for everybody to know who you are, and as well to facilitate the keeping of minutes. 5, qualified voters will be allotted 3 minutes to address the board. The 3-minute limit helps provide access for all members of the public who wish to be heard, and we will seek to answer questions within that 3-minute allotment, but some answers and dialogue may take a little longer, and I will reserve the prerogative to end any prolonged dialogues to accommodate other citizens who wish to be heard. I'd like to call upon my friend Jeff Farr, who will assume the role of master timekeeper for this evening's proceedings. 6, our topic tonight is the output from the model. Comments and questions about other town or school matters should be brought forward at another time and venue. And 7, finally, we are a community, and tonight we hope to engage in community dialogue, not debate. Nothing is being debated tonight. There is no decision on the table for consideration, as Jeff just pointed out. The purpose of dialogue is to understand perspectives, needs, and expectations. Dialogue is an opportunity for people to be heard and understood while displaying open-minded attitudes to consider all viewpoints. Your questions about our approach and analysis, coupled with your own perspectives, will go a long way to foster that dialogue. We are friends and neighbors, and we share a common purpose tonight to manage our town's finances in a fiscally responsible way. Members of the public may disagree and question the model approach and analysis, and that is okay. We will render a better quality of analysis when contrarian opinions are presented. In my experience, respectful and thoughtful presentation of all points of view are heard and considered. Belligerent presentation distracts listeners from a perspective that might otherwise have merit. I have faith that everyone here tonight will treat each other with the respect and dignity that we should all expect from our friends, neighbors, and community. I know some people have been filing in. There are copies of the slide deck along with the appendices, which are really important to go along with the deck. They're stapled separately, and they're over here on the table. Please feel free to take a copy on the way out. If you forget, these same materials are in PDF form on the calendar notice that announced this meeting tonight on the town website. Before I get into the presentation on the big screen here, let me introduce my colleagues and friends who are on the Debt Capacity Subcommittee. Roan Baldwin in the blue, two seats down, and Chris Bryant. It has been an honor and a privilege to work with these outstanding professionals in the development of this model and the analysis. This is our collective work product. This was a team effort. And for those of you here and those of you at home who know little about us, you may find our respective bios in Appendix H of the background materials attached to the appendices. And with that, got all that housekeeping out of the way, let's get right to it. So, before we begin, it's important to note that these are draft scenarios. They are hypothetical, and they are dependent on a variety of inputs, assumptions, and the model design. And these scenarios can change and will impact future analyses. The actual results that come in the years ahead, may vary from any hypothetical forecast for a variety of reasons. You can have a change in the economy. Assumptions that we thought were right today are different tomorrow. The timing and size of expenditures, big factor. Political decisions made locally, made at the state level, made at the federal level, and other factors that we can't even anticipate today. All of this come to bear in on the impact of the output of the model. Any bond issuance in the future is ultimately subject to the prior approval of Weston voters. That's you. And I can't emphasize this enough. The scenarios that we're talking about tonight should not be construed or implied to be an approval by any town board. Not the Board of Finance, not the Board of Selectmen, and not the Board of Education. So this first page is a quick summary of our findings. First, we find that the Board of Education's proposal from last spring to build a $110 million middle school as unworkable. And we think it would saddle us with too much debt. We think that it needs to go back to the Board of Ed for reconsideration. The debt service burden, depending on which amortization schedule you use, would exceed the recommended limits that Moody's looks for to award AAA ratings. We're going to go into more details about this. I'm just giving you the fast summary on this first page. Lesser capital expenditure amounts on the middle school can work, but we have to factor in the fact that the town of Weston also has capital expenditure needs. And for the purposes of our analysis, we have assumed that they add up to $20 million. And in all of our scenarios, we are including $20 million for the town, and we'll go into the details of that in a moment. The third bullet point on this box talks about a 9% debt service ratio. That's sort of a midpoint in our analysis that we just wanted to highlight, not because we're recommending this particular scenario, but just to give everybody a sense of, hey, we could potentially borrow $70 million for a middle school, $20 million for town infrastructure, keep the debt service ratio comfortably below the Moody's limit and still have dry powder, excess borrowing capacity, if we ever had a problem down the road. The property tax levy, 5 years from now, in year 5 of our forecast, would be $4,000 higher on the median assessed value home in Weston, $4,000 higher 5 years out. That's our estimate. Again, dependent upon a lot of assumptions. We'll get into more details. And finally, if the town and the Board of Education felt that, hey, maybe there's another way to do this and we don't have to build another middle school, we could just simply embrace the Collier's capital improvement plan, which projects out 10 years and adds up to about $50 million. We could do that too. And the tax levy would be less, but there's probably going to be maybe some gaps between the physical capacity of between the building and the education goals that the Board of Education may have. That is a policy decision. That is not the purview of the Board of Finance. That's about the Board of Education. So those are our 3 big findings. The rest is detail. But where do we go from here? We suggest that the Board of Education take a second swing at what can be done with a middle school. Do they still believe that we need to build a new middle school? And if the answer to that question is yes, can we do it for something less than $110 million? Are there any other alternatives that could be considered before they make that decision? And they need to kick it around and they need to make a recommendation. The timing of that is entirely up to them. But after they do make that recommendation, the Board of Finance and this subcommittee stands ready to work with the Board of Ed in modeling out on a more refined basis, what does this mean for the community? What do the numbers say? And then once that's known, then we have to go to the community, the Board of Ed, the Board of Finance, and talk to the community about making the case for the Board of Ed's recommendation. Build a middle school or don't build a middle school. Simply do repairs or do something different. And the Board of Finance has got to be able to stand behind them and say, these are the numbers, and the community's got to make, some choices. And that sentiment has to be assessed. There is no decision on the table today. I think that and I've said this before publicly, the soonest I think this community might be looking at making any kind of decision about this, the soonest would be a year from now, could be 2 years from now, if it happens at all. But it's not going to happen this year, and it's not going to have an impact on the fiscal 26 budget that we're about to evaluate starting next week. In your presentation deck, this is just a table of contents. So makes it easy for you to consistently look through the deck, which is numbered, and then in a separate binding, you've got the appendices so you can hold them separately and flip between them if you want. These first couple of slides here, I'm going to go through somewhat quickly. This subcommittee was formed in September of last year with the primary purpose to construct a dynamic forecasting model to evaluate debt necessary to finance alternative contemplated infrastructure projects. And we want to be able to assess what the impact of this debt would be on the town's budget and on the tax burden of Weston citizens. No bias. I'm just going to summarize this slide real quick right now. This subcommittee and the Board of Finance has not taken a position on any of these scenarios, for or against. We did this as an exercise to frame a discussion. The Board of Education has developed, the way we're looking at it, 2 options. One, build a new middle school for $110 million. We've talked about that. Or 2, don't build a new middle school, and spend $50 million, including $17 million on this building here at the middle school, over the next 10 years just on basic repairs. Nothing tricky happens here. It's mostly mechanical stuff that you see in the background. And then we've determined that option one doesn't work for us. And we've crafted a range of scenarios between option one and option two at lesser debt levels to keep the debt service ratio below 10%, where Moody's likes it. And we've also factored in, as you'll hear in a few minutes again, $20 million for the town to finance roads, infrastructure, and a water system. But again, we are not taking a position that what's right or what's wrong here. This is an exercise in framing what the impact on the town would be if we did any of these scenarios that we're talking about. Our policy goals are to give the Board of Selectmen and the Board of Education a range to understand so that they can do their planning. And it gives them an idea of how to do medium and long-term capital allocation, and importantly, what's the taxpayer impact. And finally, we want to be responsible in reporting to all of you, the public, what's going to be the budgetary and tax impact of these decisions. And just because it's in the model doesn't mean that this is necessarily what it's going to be. You'll see all sorts of numbers. You'll see the budget growing over 20 years. But every year that is in this model is still going to be subject to the vote of the citizens of this town at ATBM. So just remember, this is just an exercise in sizing. The model that we're relying upon is one that Jeff and Roan and I built 3 summers ago, summer of '22. And since then, we've updated it with new data. We've put a few new bells and whistles into it. The very first year of the model, we have layered in the proposed fiscal '26 operating budget and capital improvement plans. This should not be construed as the Board of Finance is approving it. We're just using it as a starting point. And it's very important that the public understand this model has got nothing to do with the budget approval process we're about to go through. So please avoid that mistake of conflating that somehow this model is part and parcel of the budget process. It is not. Embedded in the model is the town's own 5-year forecast. That's layered in here. And we also have the town and the Board of Education's capital improvement and major expenditure plans layered in. We are relying upon the capital improvement budget that the town has put together over the first 5 years. We're not saying that we approve it or disapprove it, but that's what we're using in the model. And then the 10-year capital plan for the Board of Ed is the one that Colliers has put together.
Mike, could you comment on Colliers, how that came about? Because members of the public don't.
Okay, I can let me comment on it on a later slide. Okay, but we'll get there. The model uses a standardized growth rate beyond the Board of Selectmen and Board of Education capital plans through year 20. We'll talk in more detail about that when we get to the assumptions. So the model's projections are more aligned with the Board of Selectmen and Board of Education goals in the first 10 years. And then after 10 years, directionally accurate might even be strong, but directionally close. You know, it's like this is where it's going to go 10 years out based on the assumptions given. Our data sources, and this is, Jeff, this is the next section, I'll get to you on this. Like I said, we're using the town operating budget for fiscal '25, We've layered in the fiscal 26 proposed budget. We're using the forecast for fiscal 27 through 30 in the forecast from the town that was prepared by the town administrator. And we are using the town's capital improvement plan that the town administrator also gave us. For the Board of Education, the operating budgets that were approved for fiscal 25, the proposed budget for fiscal 26, and then the Collier's report that was put together and presented by the Board of Education last November. And this was a plan that the Board of Education asked Collier's to put together. They're a retained consultant, and they said, if we didn't build a middle school, what do we have to spend over the next 10 years to make sure that the schools can function? And it's a $50 million plan. They spent a lot of time talking about it at a meeting in November. And if you want to learn more about it and hear the presentation, all the materials are still online, and you're welcome to go back and look at that. Collier's is also brings a lot of expertise in building schools. The one open question that I still have about the Collier's report is, if after 10 years, if this is the path we take, 10 years later, have we extended the useful life of the middle school and the other schools? Or are we going to be in a position where we're going to have to make a decision then about building a new school? And I don't know the answer to that. So if you're curious about it, ask the Board of Ed, because I am. So this is the fun part. This is the second of the handouts that you have, all the appendices. We ran 30 different scenarios in this model. There are 3 different operating growth rate scenarios. There's a base case, there's a low growth, there's a high growth scenario. And then we have 5 different variations of capital expenditure. And we'll get into the details of that in a minute. And then we consider, how do we finance it? Do we finance it over 20 years? That is a 20-year amortization schedule. We pay back the loan over 20 years evenly, or do we do it over 30 years? So amortization, for those who are not in finance, just means how do you pay it back? And by the way, one of the appendices in the back has got a glossary that tries to define some of the finance terms that those who are not finance oriented, can refer to. I think it's in Appendix G. So let's talk about these operating growth rates for the town budget. I have already explained we're using the fiscal 26 proposed budget. After 2020, from 2027 to 2030, we're using the town's forecast. Over that period, the budget is forecast to grow 4.6% annually. That's just the math. And then when we get to fiscal 2031 and beyond, these are the growth rate scenarios, the 3 scenarios that we're using. The base case, we're assuming that the budget grows every year 3%. And then in the low operating growth case, we're assuming 2%. And then in the high operating growth case, 5%. Let me give you a little bit of context on this, okay? If you can, hopefully you can see this cursor moving around here. Okay. In the base case, if I were to look at the growth rate, CAGR, C-A-G-R, that's compound annual growth rate, but just think of it as growth. If I were to look at the growth rate between fiscal 25 and go out 20 years to 2044 to come up with one smooth growth rate, it's 3.42%. Over the last 20 years, from 2005 to 2024, the town's operating budget only grew at 2.8%. So what I want to underline for everybody from our perspective, we think that the base case is conservative. We're going to have questions after I get through the presentation, so you'll have a chance. Thank you. We could have easily justified growing the out years at 2.8%. We wanted to be more conservative than that, and I'll talk more about that in a little bit. On the low growth, we did 2.68% as the long-term growth rate in the forecast. Again, compare that to the 2.8 of the last 20 years. And then on the high side, we're assuming 4.9%, which that's a long time, 20 years, to sustain 4.9%. And it's probably unrealistic because think about this, everybody in this room and everybody watching at home would have to come out for 20 years in a row and every year vote for 4.9%. Just rings not quite true, but again, this is a math exercise, and we wanted to be able to say, hey, we did a high growth rate. On the Board of Ed side, we've talked about fiscal 25 and fiscal 26. After fiscal 26, we were not given any growth rates by the Board of Ed or their professionals. So we were using a slightly higher growth rate in the base case, largely justified by the weight of the budget, the Board of Ed budget as a percentage of the total town budget, and healthcare costs are just really expensive. And you're going to hear a lot about that in in about a week when we go through budget review with the Board of Ed. The low operating growth case is a little bit higher than what we were assuming for the town, and we kept 5% for the high. Same slide as before. The difference is that the base case, the historic rate for the Board of Education over the last 20 years, the growth rate has been 2.6%. So when you compare the long-term growth rate over 20 years that's in our model for the Board of Ed in the base case, we're a full percentage point above the historic average. We're 1.1 above. On the low side, we're just slightly below the historic average. And again, we're way above on the high side. So just wanted everybody to understand we considered all these different scenarios. There are other revenues that are embedded in the forecast. Fiscal 25, we've got non-tax sources of revenue, user fees, state grants, federal grants, adding up to $4.6 million. In the proposed budget this year, it's totaling 4.7. For fiscal 27 and beyond, we just decided to flatline 4.7. We're not growing it. We're not making any assumptions that it's going to get any bigger. Is it vulnerable? Absolutely. And we'll talk about that. So to give you perspective, a 1 point change in the mill rate is about $3 million. So if we were to lose $3 million out of that 4.7, the impact of that is 1 mil. I think I've beaten this thing to death. Capital improvement plan, we got it from the town, we got it from the Board of Ed. This is an important assumption, this third bullet. We have probably underspent on maintenance and capital improvements over the last several years. We're making an assumption that we're going to cap the amount that the model will tax the town every year for capital improvements at $3.5 million. Any amount above that is going to be funded through long-term debt. And that $3.5 million cap right there, we're going to grow it at 3% a year. So when you get to the far end out at year 20, the capital improvement plan tax levy annual is on an order of magnitude, gosh, probably about close to $5 million. I'd have to go back and take a look at that last number. But the point, though, is that we're going to say a certain portion is going to be funded every year through the tax levy, and the rest of it has to be financed. So you've heard me talk about $20 million for the town's infrastructure needs. The town's already approved up to $6 million for road paving. There are various infrastructure projects that the town currently estimates at $10 million. The details of this are still a little murky, and in the absence of better information, we're just running with $10 million for the moment. I expect that this number is going to be refined over the next year or so. And then we've got the water system project with Ravenwood. More details about that in a moment, but that's expected to cost $4 million. And then for the other major capital expenditure that we're playing with from the Board of Education is, in the very first scenario, we're looking at $88 million, which assumes a 20% reimbursement on a gross construction cost of $110 million. We've modeled that. We think it's important for everybody to see it and understand why it doesn't work. And we're not going to make any assumptions that we're going to borrow all the money all at once. We split it up into roughly equal pieces, and we made the assumption that it would take place in fiscal 27 and fiscal year 28. By the way, the town's infrastructure projects, the three I just talked about, are also assumed to take place in fiscal 27. So the big expenditures are 2 years down the road in the model. So now we're at the part of the scenarios where we're talking about the 5 different capital expenditure scenarios. The first one is no major middle school renovation. We just do the Collier's plan. The second one is we're going to figure out how much could we spend on the middle school and still generate an 8% debt service ratio in fiscal year 28. That's the 4th year of the forecast. We are forcing the model to tell us what could we spend and keep debt service at 8%. And that's the sum of principal and interest on the bond that finances not only the school, but also the other town infrastructure needs, including the water system, such that the principal and interest is no more than 8% of the town's budget. And then the next scenario is, we said 9% debt service ratio. And the fourth scenario is 10% debt service. This is the limit that Moody's likes to see. They don't want to see it really go much more than that. It's been a kind of a constant rule of thumb in the muni markets for a long time. 10% is about the limit. The problem with going out and borrowing so much money that you're at the 10%, it doesn't leave you a lot of room to deal with emergencies. You don't have any borrowing capacity reserve if there's a problem. And then the last one is, what does it look like if we borrowed $88 million on the $110 million plan? Again, in all of these scenarios, we're assuming $20 million for the town. That's embedded in. And in this very first scenario, no major middle school renovation, we're using the full Collier's plan. In all of these subsequent analyses, these last 4, we use the Collier's plan and we subtract out the $17 million that's allocated for the middle school. You're not going to spend that money. Existing debt, as Jeff described, is embedded in the model and it rolls out the way it's currently scheduled. New debt would start in the model in fiscal 27 and beyond. We are assuming an interest rate of 5% for all borrowings. And just to give you perspective, if we were to go to market today with 30 years, I was actually checking today, we could probably get in the high threes, 3.9, maybe 4, kind of depends on structure. We're talking about a conservative assumption that 2 years forward, interest rates are going to be considerably higher than they are today, just to be conservative. If it's lower, God bless. If it's higher, it's going to change the outputs. And in these scenarios, this is the 2. Remember, we had 3, 5, and 2 to get to 30 scenarios. We're amortizing over 20 years and 30 years. And principal interest are paid semi-annually, and the model calculates that. One footnote on the water project, we will not be using publicly issued bonds to finance that $4 million. There is a state revolving fund that affords us a 20-year amortization with a 3% interest expense. The program is further assumed to afford us a 25% principal forgiveness in year 5, and the model has been modified to accommodate for the forgiveness, and then the remaining roughly $3 million would be repaid evenly over the remaining 15 years. Other assumptions, just so that we can get a better handle on what's happening to the mill rate, we're using the grand list that was generated in the last reval in October of 23. We didn't want to completely flatline it, so in non-reval years, we're growing it a little more than 0.5%, and then in the reval years that are listed here, we're assuming the grand list pops no more than 5%. Well, not no more, it's just 5%. Tax collection rate, we're going to use 98.4 for fiscal 27 and beyond. We will use the proposed budget of 98.5 for fiscal 26. We just didn't want to keep it out there at 98.5 forever, as we just dialed it back a little bit. And just to remind everybody, the tax levy that is determined in the model is the sum of the operating expenses for the town and the schools, plus the portion of the capital improvement plan, initially $3.5 million, plus the annual debt service, less the annual revenue. These next items are really metrics to give you a sense of the impact for everybody in town. The median house value, or median assessed value, for fiscal year 25 is $713,000. That's 70% of the median market value of a little more than $1 million. And for the purposes of calculating in the forecast, we assume that the median house value stays flat in non-reval years and then pops 5% in the reval years. And that makes a difference in terms of what's the tax burden that we determine on a median house value. We're assuming that the town's population stays flat, and that impacts our per capita analyses. The number of households stays flat at about 3,500. And I will walk you through very quickly at the end of this deck, Appendix A, just to show you the 20-year average in the town and Board of Ed budgets. for various elements, as well as the growth rates, just so that you can have something to look back at when you're looking at the forecasts, so that it gives you context. The model output. I'm not going to go through all 30 scenarios, but I am going to do a very quick walkthrough of the summary pages for appendices B, C, and D that give you all the details of all 30 on 3 pages, all 30 scenarios. We'll get there. And then there are some key debt metrics: debt service as a percentage of expenditures, debt per capita, debt as a percentage of total expenditures, and then debt as a percentage of grand list. And then, of course, we calculate the tax impact. What's the mill rate going to be? And what's the tax on the median assessed home value in Weston? So, pretty much covered that. What the output also shows us is unused debt capacity. And at the bottom of every one of the detailed scenarios, it gives you the algorithm on how we calculated it. But we're always assuming that the maximum debt service that we could go to, if we had to, is 10%, even when we're back solving for an 8% or a 9% scenario. And it's the difference between the two that tells us what's our unused debt capacity. It's in here. I don't know it off the top of my head, but I'm happy to have your questions. Just let me punch through this. We're going to get there. I knew this was going to be a long part of the meeting, but we will stay here as long as you can ask us questions. But this sets context. But does anybody on the board know off the top of the head? Yeah, that sounds about right. Yeah, we've got lots of capacity. The dollar amount is what I don't know off the top of my head. Oh, okay. My apologies. Yeah. So this is the big money shot slide. How much can we spend on a middle school under the 5 capital expenditure scenarios? And let me explain. On the left side here, under the header 20-year amortization, oops, got ahead. If we were to do the Collier's only report, approach, we're not spending any money on a middle school. If we solve for 8%, we could spend as much as $57 million on a new middle school. It's not the debt, it's what you could spend on a middle school. So you benchmark that 57 against the 110 on the far right. At a 9%, using 20 years, it's $69.5 million. And then at 10%, it's almost $82 million. And then the full plan, like we talked about, is 110. These numbers at the bottom, that's the mill rate that the model tells us would be in place in year 5. We're not telling you here, it's back in the details, what the mill rate would be out in year 20, and we'll talk about that. But for those of us who have been in finance, looking out 5 years usually can give people a lot of confidence. The further out you go, the less confidence you can have in the numbers, because too many things vary. We'll talk about it. I'll show you where it is in the scenarios. But for our purposes in sizing up what can we afford and what's going to be the tax impact in the medium term, this is what we're talking about. The alternative is if we were to... I'm showing you just the first 5 years, the impact in the first 5 years. But please, I'd really like to wait for questions. The total forecast period is 20 years. Correct. Okay. Over here on the right, it's the same analysis, except we're amortizing the debt over 30 years. And here, under a longer amortization period, the town could afford more money for the schools by comparison. So in the 8% scenario, under 30 years, the town could spend $73 million on a middle school. On a 20-year amortization, to stay within the 8%, you could only spend 57. So you get more money to spend in the 30-year amortization, but you're in debt for longer. Here we talk about the total amount of debt and then the excess debt capacity. The blue column here shows you what the total debt balance would be for each of the scenarios, the no middle school scenario, the 8% debt service scenario, 9% debt service, 10%, and then this original BOE plan is almost $99 million, and that means we're spending $110 million on the Board of Education. Same exercise over here with a 30-year amort. You can see the difference in the total amount of debt with the blue columns. What you also see at the same time is what is the declining level of excess debt capacity, and this is as measured in year 5 of the forecast. When you look further out, we're still calculating excess debt capacity, which only grows because we're paying down the principal on the debt. And then this is the slide that I think is going to get a lot of scrutiny. What's the tax levy on the median assessed home value? Under the 20-year amort, if we don't spend on a new middle school 5 years out in the forecast, the tax levy on the median assessed home value would grow to almost $20,000. Today, it's about $16,000. So this tells you what it looks like 5 years out. The tax levy continues to grow in the out years. I'll show you where that is. But again, we want to show you the medium-term impact of if we spend money on a middle school, what's it going to look like? Okay? We're not trying to hide what's happening long-term. We're just trying to get you focused on we spend this is going to be the impact in the foreseeable future. I'm sorry, I can't hear you. I'm almost done. Because the Board of Education needs to understand how much, okay, I really would appreciate all right, ma'am, we are almost at the end, so if you could just beg your indulgence a little bit longer. Thank you. This shows what the tax levy is going to be 5 years out under these different scenarios. This is important to understand because the Board of Education is going to go back and take another swing at what they want to do with the middle school. You, the public, should understand when they start throwing numbers around how this could impact you. You are being given information so that you can go to those meetings in the future with the Board of Education and have context for understanding what they're talking about. And this has been in response to what the public was asking us to do a year ago and even earlier than that, no Board of Finance has ever in the past done this. And I think that's why I'm begging a little bit of indulgence so that everybody can understand a lot of work went into this. The numbers are probably still going to change, but it's directionally should give you some comfort to understand what the tax impact could be for you as the Board of Ed starts its deliberations. I don't even know if I want to talk about this slide. If anybody's got questions about this slide, bring it up during the Q&A. There are some risks to the forecast that I think bear discussion. First off, the community support is critical here. We can't issue debt unless the town votes for it. The grant program, from the reimbursement from the state, we're making a big assumption in this model that whatever we do, we're going to get 20% back from the state. If that doesn't hold up, it's not going to work, because what we learned from the Facilities Optimization Committee 2 years ago is that if you build new, you get 11 to 13% reimbursement from the state. If you renovate as new, and you don't tear this all down, you just do major construction, you can get 20%. The theory from a policy perspective by the state is that if you renovate as new, it should cost a lot less than building new. Therefore, we're willing to reimburse you more. The trick with Colliers is that they are operating on an assumption right now that building new would be less expensive than renovating. And that's why they can justify 20%, and they've done it in another school district in the state. It's a big if, and it's a vulnerability to the forecast. The interest rate, I've already talked about the risk on the 5%. We'll move on from that. Federal grants. That's one good way of summarizing it. We get $700,000 a year in special education funding. It comes from the Department of Education. Be your own judge. Department of what? Yes. Tariff impact. If we start levying starting Saturday, 25% tariffs on aluminum and steel, that's going to have an impact across a lot of areas. We're talking about HVAC in the fiscal 26 budget. I hear HVAC and I see big shiny things made of metal. And it's like, you can be certain that one of my questions is going to be, have you gone back to reprice that HVAC? These are not an exhaustive list of risks, but anything can pop up that can change. I'm almost at the end. I'm really close. Colliers is the consulting firm that Board of Ed hired to do the analysis of what would it cost to just fix up the schools and not do a major renovation. Talked about this. Okay. So stakeholder input, we have spoken with and will continue to speak with the Board of Selectmen and the Board of Education. Public input, it's coming up. The long-term utility of this model, we hope that this becomes an interactive, dynamic exercise with the Board of Ed, with the Board of Selectmen, as assumptions change. And we are happy to work with the other boards on that. And ultimately, we hope that, this guides the elected leadership, it guides you to understand what's going on, and ultimately, we hope that we can just hand this model over to Rick and Carl and the folks over at Town Hall, and they can even build on this. We're just doing this for debt capacity purposes. You could build it out to do long-term forecasting for budgets. And with that, I can do a real quick walkthrough, really quick, of the appendices. This is the context of the historic averages. Just, you can look at that. Just this big mess here that says Appendix B summarizes all 10 scenarios that are right behind it for the base case. And I'm going to blow this up because I know you can't see it. I know I couldn't see it. But this gives you a detail over the first 5 years. It gives you every year. And then because it's a 20-year model, we're just showing you the columns for year 10, year 15, and year 20. If we had put all 20 years on here, you'd be looking at a font of 6, and no one would be able to read this. Again, I want to emphasize the farther out you go, the less reliable these models are. So there are 10 scenarios behind B. Hello. I can't get this. There we go. Here's, here's the summary for C. All the scenarios are numbered individually, and then they're summarized up here at the top. D is the high rate, growth rate. E, this is the Collier's 10-year plan. You might be curious about how the money's being allocated by school. That's in Appendix E. The town's capital improvement budget going out 5 years is in Appendix F. G is the glossary. And then Appendix H are the subcommittee biographies with really pretty pictures of the three of us on the subcommittee. And with that, I am happy to entertain questions. We will entertain questions from the public. If you would, please step up to the microphone over there at the podium. And yeah, tell me your name. I guess, okay. Please introduce yourself and your address, please. Could you turn on the microphone, please, Michelle? Just hit the button there and the light turns green.
Hi.
Speak into the mic.
My name is Michelle Ligori, and
Thank
I'm
you.
on Georgetown Road. We've just spent an hour in doing what I call the cart before the horse, which is talking about all of these expenses without having a project. I have so first of all, I'm 70 years old. I brought my husband here who had just had hip replacement surgery yesterday so that we could participate in actually knowing what is going on for our town and before the budget. And all I hear is that it may be this number, but it may not be this number. It may be this debt percentage, but it may not be this debt percentage. I didn't come here tonight to lose time that I can never get back, which is no answer to this. We have wasted over $500,000 with the Tecton and all of the other studies, and now we're going to have to go back to do more studies, and this is going to get pushed out to have more expenses when where you should be, and I went on the school tour, should have been routine maintenance in these schools. You have let things go to the point that they are really in bad shape. I even did FOIA records with the mold that's going on in one of the schools. So don't tell me that this is going to continue to go on and you're doing nothing, and to show me your exercises. I want to hear the numbers. I want to hear the facts. I want to hear that you are going to not, what is it called? Take away the tax relief for the seniors in this town, because this is unsustainable. This is not right. And I'm just, we don't have to go through these 30 scenarios. And bottom line, the thing is, my biggest thing here is, why should you be trusted with an additional X millions in debt to this town and your constituents, your family, when you fail and continue to fail as stewards in a thoughtful and prudent way. This has been going on for many years. You could have thought about other alternative scenarios. And another thing is that I haven't heard once in any of the things that are going on for costs in the academics. And there is one person who is very, very well known internationally and at the Capitol, Clements. Her name is Jean Clements. I want it on the record so that you know that this is somebody who's dedicated to programming improvements in school nationwide. But we don't talk about that. We talk about brick and mortar. We talk about wasteful time. We talk about wasting my time, my life, and I'm having my husband in pain sitting there so that we can participate in this town. And you provide no information. Now, I'm not well-versed in finance, but I do know that it's not fair that you don't provide that information with things that you're talking about at $100 million. Thank you.
Thank you. Go ahead. Your name and local address.
Hi, I'm Jasmine. I live at 14 Old Field,
Jasmine, what's your last name?
Kazakov.
Pardon?
Kazakov.
Okay.
First, thank you for going through this with us. I greatly appreciate it. I came with a recommendation, which is for page 26, to kind of combine it with page 28.
Let me open it up so everybody can see where you are.
On page 26, you have the graph, which shows the amount that can be spent in the different scenarios.
Yep.
And I think that it should go along with page 28, which tells us, based on the medium in household costs, what the price should be on the bottom. The reason why is because when we communicate with the town about what's important, it's really hard for them to just pull out multiple pages. Call it laziness, call it overtired, I don't know. But what it is that we need a clearer way of describing what are these scenarios and how much money it will impact per household.
This is what this slide does.
Oh, okay.
The one we skipped.
But I think that the page 26 is easier to understand for a lot of people, and so that would be my recommendation.
Thank you.
The second thing that I would like to understand is we talked a lot about how these scenarios are built on the sort of the capital costs, the operating costs that the $20 million. I guess as someone that's new, I'm a little confused about how some of these infrastructures have been delayed, because when we first moved here, we heard about the surplus that the town has and our general fund. And so a lot of us last year when we voted were assuming that we wanted to keep the expenditure as actual expenditures and then the projected over excess to be covered by the general fund. And so I'm a little confused, and if someone could explain to me how that surplus, because I think we have, what, 16, there's some amount in there.
$15 million in our general reserve fund in cash, is that what you're talking about?
Right, and so why can't we apply those to this
Okay.
to improve the model? If someone could help us really understand that, because this is a big topic for, I think, this model, as well as the coming budget discussions that we're going to have soon.
All right.
Me to comment on that?
Yeah, go ahead.
So separately, there was a committee that focused on fund balance. And if you attended in January, they came back with a recommendation to maintain a 20% unassigned fund balance ratio. So that's basically the ratio of the unassigned fund balance to the total expenditures of the town in any year. And there's justification for that to be able to maintain a AAA rating. If you look at even though we have a $16 million unassigned fund balance right now, If you look at it, it's 23%. So we are in excess of the 20%, so there is excess unassigned fund balance. It's about $2.3 million. So there is $2.3 million that could be spent out of that unassigned fund balance and still maintain the 20% fund balance rating based on this year's budget, okay? In future years, if the budget increases, that unassigned fund balance has to increase as well. So we have to keep that in mind. But there is legitimately $2.3 million, and there is consideration on how to spend that. But there's only $2.3 million. There's not, you can't spend 16. If you spent the 16, we would not have a very attractive financial rating.
Okay,
Because-
so that excess right there, the minimal amount, the 2.3 can be spent on, like road cleaning or whatever, but
Or special appropriations. We approved a $600,000 special appropriation for the Ravenwood water system.
I see.
So it's there as a security against those kind of unexpected expenditures. So yes, it can be spent, but understand that the magnitude of the excess unassigned fund balance pales in comparison to the numbers that are being contemplated for facilities, for $6 million of road paving for the town, $4 million for the water system, $10 million for facilities, and you've seen the potential numbers for the school renovations.
And can you help me understand briefly what the Ravenwood water system is? I try to be, but I have little kids. Sometimes I'm in, sometimes I'm out. I'm just.
Jeff's going to answer that.
As the oldest member serving on this board, back in the 1970s, an issue arose from the town's transfer station where local wells were pulling in some bad stuff that was in the ground. That went to court, and a stipulated judgment required the town to build a water system to supply domestic water to, 35 homes or so in the, pardon me? Just, okay, 30 in the Ravenwood area. The town is responsible for maintaining that system, and it has reached the end of its economic life. It's been in service almost 50 years, and actually represents a danger to people working in and around it. So that system is being replaced. This was a recognized need 3 years ago when the town got a $3 million grant through the ARPA fund, and a majority of that went to replace that water system. So that's what's going on there.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jasmine. Other questions? Sir?
Travis Burrell, 44 Birch Hill Road. I'd like to thank you for the opportunity to speak at tonight's meeting. I'm here to raise some serious concerns about the presentation from the Board of Finance Chair, Mr. Imber, because I believe it's incomplete and misleading in ways that affect us all as taxpayers. First, the presentation only shows the tax impact of borrowing scenarios over the next 5 years, projecting a 20 to 25% increase. That sounds significant, but it's just the tip of the iceberg. What's not being highlighted are the longer-term impacts over 10, 15, and 20 years, where tax increases are projected to skyrocket 100 or even 200%. These aren't guesses. The models exist, and they're buried in the appendix of the presentation. But they won't openly be shared or explained tonight. We deserve to know the full picture, not just the short-term snapshot, because these dramatic increases will affect our families for decades. Second, while a no-debt line was added to one chart showing the mill rate projections for the next 5 years, this addition feels like an afterthought, a see-ya move, or a distraction, rather than a serious attempt to explore alternatives. The no debt scenario is not fully modeled long-term in the appendixes and is excluded from the summary findings. This does not include practical options like school closures, which could significantly alter tax projections. If this was a genuine effort to inform us, the no debt option would be fully fleshed out and compared side to side with the debt scenarios. Instead, it's a superficial nod that sidesteps the real discussion. Debt remains the focus, and it's the most expensive option, driving the biggest tax hikes. Finally, there's a slide labeled no bias, but the selective inclusion of a half-baked no debt option, along with the focus on debt scenarios and downplaying the massive long-term tax increases, suggest a preference for borrowing. True neutrality would mean presenting us clearly all the short-term and long-term tax implications, including the practical alternatives like school closures, letting us decide how reliable that data is and what's best for our town. I urge the board to demand a more transparent and more balanced presentation that includes a fully modeled no-debt scenario with alternatives like school closures. We can't make informed decisions without critical information when it's left hidden. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Worrell. If the crowd is interested, I'm happy to go through the appendices and show you some of the long-term impact, if you think that would be a useful, utilization of time. But the one thing, like I've said throughout the presentation, when you go out beyond 5 years, you're starting to get into the world of guessing. We're making an assumption that the Board of Selectmen town budget is growing at 3% in the base case, and it's growing at 3.75 for the Board of Education. Over a 20-year period, the compounding effect is considerable. So it does look bad when you look way out. Well, I'm getting to that, and I appreciate that. The school closure option is a major policy kind of decision that is beyond the consideration of the Board of Finance, because what our mandate was come back to the Board of Ed of what could we afford in the way of building a new middle school. That's really what we were asked to do, not model out what would happen if you close the school. And by the way, and I'm not have as much depth on this as Roan does, but 2 prior studies, the Silver and Petruccelli study and the Tecton study, came to the conclusion that there is nominal savings, if any, from going from a 4-school model to a 3-school model. Roan, do you want to talk about that?
I mean, we can show you can look at the reports in terms of it, but perhaps the Board of Ed will come back and look at a closure scenario and provide their analysis of what the capital costs are related to it and what the operating cost savings or impact is, and then we can model that. So,
Doing a school closure is way beyond the expertise of the Board of Finance to credibly come up with what's that alternative.
but I want to make a different comment on this issue. The purpose of this subcommittee was to really focus on debt capacity. And as Michael said, this model can certainly lend itself to long-term budget projections and tax projections. But the attempt is to try to digest a lot of information down to the most meaningful things. One of the reasons why Michael has highlighted the year 5 or fiscal year 2028 is because that is when the peak is for debt metrics, okay? The actual, as you go out further in time, the debt metrics get better and better and better. But it's year 5 when they're most stressed. And that's why he's highlighted this, and that's what the constraining factor is on debt. Now that's different from, because what drives the increase in taxes in the out years is not debt from capital expenditures, it's the underlying growth rate in the operating budgets. And that's an important issue, and it's something that's got to be understood, that yes, at these rates, the compounded impact from operating expenditures is a doubling of the tax base. But again, our purpose is to try to put some parameters around what can be affordable and within the debt constraints that have been identified for different capital things. And that's why year 5 is highlighted, and to focus on that. So it's, and that's the main purpose that we're trying to, this subcommittee has focused on.
One point, and this is back pocket analysis I had ready in anticipation of questions like this, Mr. Worrell, is that if we were to look at what was the tax levy over the last 20 years on the median assessed value and look at how it grew, if you looked at what was the tax levy in 2005 and what was it in 2024, and you just did a simple ratio of those two numbers, the tax levy grew 58% over 20 years. Well, the no debt policy, the no debt approach is in there. It's the very first one that we looked at. It's the Collier's plan. We're not building a new middle school. We're still building $20 million and financing that for the town. If you're saying you want to see the model of just for the point of we're not going to have any debt at all, it is in here. We skipped that slide, which I'm happy to go back to and walk you through it.
Well, in fairness, Michael, the Collier scenario does involve debt because we are issuing, first of all.
Yeah, that's true.
We've already approved, the town has approved $6 million of debt issuance for the roads. So that's, it's hard to go back and say no debt at this point since that has been approved. There's also in these scenarios, as we talked about, $4 million for the water system, $10 million for the town facilities, and there's other debt involved in financing the annual capital levy above the $3.5 million, which is the Collier's scenario. So it is fair to say, and in the what's called the Collier's scenario, which is the $20 million for the town plus that for the different town facilities, Collier's, the peak debt service is 3.2% roughly. So that is a no debt, depending on your assumptions about no debt, it would be 3.2% less than what's projected in that scenario.
Mr. Worrell, this slide here that we skipped over because the crowd was getting anxious to start asking questions. If you look at this green line here, this is a breakdown of the current tax levy on the median assessed value if you stripped away all debt, all capital improvements, all increases to the current operating expense. This is the portion, $15,249 of the $16,000 and change, that's really attributable to operating expenses. No debt. I didn't explain this before because I skipped it.
It was in the material that I read online.
Well, yes, it was, but you seemed to come back to it, and so I thought that you just hadn't seen that. But you're right, it's not. Okay. No, it's not.
Sorry, can I ask, can
I
I
think
move
it's
on?
time for other questions.
Yeah, my name's Lisa Yonchi. I'm at 9 Partridge Lane. Like I told Michael at the beginning, I have 2 children. I have a 6-year-old and a 9-year-old, so I have very much skin in the game of what is done with this middle school. The idea of closing the middle school, to me, seems like a complete non-option because our children need a middle school. They need a place to have as their own as they grow from 5th graders to high schoolers. I do have a question and a comment as to the presentation that was made. I think some of the frustration, maybe in this room or just in general in the town, is that as anyone who's in this building sees, this building needs a lot of work. And to be honest, it probably needed a lot of this work 10 to 15 years ago. So we're at a time juncture here where decisions need to be made. And I completely understand that your job was to review the Board of Education's plan and that you are now saying that it is too expensive per everything you've reviewed tonight. It seems to me that it would be beneficial as you go back to the Board of Ed for one or multiple members from this committee to be part of the process as the Board of Ed reviews their plans so that we don't have another stopgap measure where they come up with a new plan, and then you guys take 6 to 8 months to review because you have a lot of work to do, and then you say, this is too expensive because of X, Y, and Z. It seems like these two committees really need to talk together so we can try to have a plan that works fiscally and to get it implemented as quickly as possible. Because I think our kids deserve, if not new, a much better middle school than where it is right now. My second question, which Michael, you brought up in your presentation, and I think is incredibly important, is the Colliers idea of the $55 million repair. Frankly, it really concerns me. It concerns me because my concern is that we are going to go with doing a cheaper option only to pay much more in the long run.
That's a
And
big open
anyone
question.
who has a home knows when your roof is in a bad repair and you're debating replacing the roof or making repairs on the roof, when you go for the repair option, a lot of times that means when it's time to do more repairs, they're more expensive because there's more damage that is done in that leeway. And I think that's an issue and a concern that really needs to be addressed before the Colliers report model is adapted. Thank you.
100%. Lisa, thank you for your remarks. And by the way, when we were finalizing this presentation that we gave to the full Board of Finance last week, I did call Steve Ezzies and say, look, I want you to be aware of what our findings are. And we, the subcommittee, we would be happy to meet with the Board of Education or the Board of Education's own Finance Committee and work collaboratively with them as they go through this process. So you're spot on. Thank you.
Did you get a response yet?
Well, yeah, we spoke. He said, yeah, that would be welcome.
Well, Michael, just to highlight something, if you could go back to page where you talk about next steps in the summary.
Oh, okay, sure.
I think your comment highlights one thing that I think needs to be reflected a little bit in the next page here. This suggests a very sequential kind of process where we do modeling after they got a recommendation. I think we want more of a parallel kind of process working
Yeah,
with
no,
them.
that's
Look,
fair.
It's a tweak, but I think that gets
Yeah.
at the
It's
concern that you
dynamic.
have. And I think that's something that we recognized after we put this together.
Yeah, Teresa. So you're saying show the long-term forecast of the the portion of the tax levy attributable only to, yeah, we can do something like that. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah.
And this is the little
Yeah.
extra, I'm not saying it's de minimis, but it is, if you look at the impact of the operating budgets on taxes year after year, it's going to see what the differential is.
Okay.
We can definitely show that. I can tell you the math is, it's that minus debt service percent. So it's either going to be minus 3.2 for Colliers, or 8, 9, 10, or 10.5 or 12.5 for the full $110 million scenarios. That's what the numbers are going to show.
So essentially 90% of the growth in taxes is attributable to the operating budget.
That is a true statement.
No, that's not what I'm saying. It's not the growth. I'm just saying the actual tax burden on a household. The difference between that and no debt is the debt service. The debt service is either 3.2 at the lowest or 10 at the highest. So
In this meeting and prior meetings, and just, say, we're concerned about the taxes. So it help us understand as an organization, how much of the operating budget goes each year, especially when it's talking jump ups of 4.6%, 5 years. And that's, what do we focus on? We focus on the outcome and how people to.
Excuse me, Terry, would you mind putting your microphone on, please?
how can those two work together to, minimize the tax impact,
Fair point. Go ahead.
Good evening, Board. My name is Aaron Burakoff. I live at 38 Northfield Woods Road. I'm here tonight. My wife, Julie, and I moved here 4 years ago. We have, actually very similar to Lisa, a 9-year-old, a 6-year-old. We also have an 8-month-old. We moved to Weston because of the school system here, because of the great reputation that the school system has. We are very much invested in seeing that school system continue to be a terrific one, be a wonderful one. And we do have serious concerns about the state of this building that we're in now. And we've heard that there are, for example, sinks in the science labs that don't even work and are not conducive to learning environment. So I know we're not here tonight to advocate for or against renovation, but I just want to share that context. And also for many other friends we have who couldn't make it here tonight because they're home with their kids. And I chose coming instead of putting 3 kids to bed at once. So that was an easy one. But anyway, in terms of what we're talking about tonight, something that jumped out is slide 23. Just some of the assumptions that were made about median house values and population over the course of moving forward. And I'm going to just throw some questions out there. I think they're kind of lofty and don't have easy answers, but certainly there's a really high correlation between median home values and quality of education in a given town. And just as we think out 5, 10, 20, 30 years, I think it's fair to think that different levels of investment in our town education could affect median house values and could affect the number of people who live in town. So I don't expect answers tonight, but maybe something to think about is, or if you did think about that ways that the investments that we make in the schools could impact some of these assumptions. Thank you.
Thanks, Aaron. I don't know if they are or aren't. I got the number from Rick, and it's part of. Yeah, we can bridge that. We're at some point we're going to sit down. I hope with the finance committee of the Board of Ed, and they're going to see this in detail and make sure. We'll ask that question. It's a fair one.
I just want to interject one thing, though, which is related to this, which is, and there was a comment about page 28 and 26 being the most important ones. I actually think page 27 is the most important one. And I just want to highlight that because if you believe that we need to invest more in the schools, you've also got to be very conscious of not over-investing in one school and tying up all your debt capacity and then finding out that you have down the road needs in other schools and you've tapped out all your debt capacity. And page 27 highlights what your debt capacity remaining is under different investment scenarios. For those of us who've been here a long time, and I've been here 30 years, this town incurred $80 million worth of debt, primarily to build the intermediate school and to do a large renovation of a portion of the high school back in 2005. We then had the financial crisis hit, and we have struggled to be able to get the financial confidence to be able to incur more debt to be able to put into our facilities since then, and we clearly invested all of our debt capacity in 2 facilities at that point. That's one of the reasons why you see the middle school now in the shape that it's in. So just be conscious that when you're saying if you're trying to think that we should invest as much as possible, quote unquote, because you believe in having quality schools, make sure you consider the impact on all of the schools and how we tap out our debt capacity under these different scenarios.
I'm going to make one remark, and then I'm going to let Andy come up. I couldn't agree more with Roan about you got to consider all the schools. One of the good things about a model like this is that all of a sudden we've got a comprehensive framework, and it really focuses thinking. So I've already had conversations with Phil Cross, and he knows what's in here. He's been watching, and he's already thinking about what else needs to be done with Hurlbut. Andy, and then Mr. Ligori in the back. And you don't have to get up. You can just stand or shout real loud from your chair. But Andy, go ahead. Oh, well, what While Andy's talking, Peter or James, can we run out with a wireless mic to give to Mr. Ligori here so he doesn't have to get up and the folks online can hear his question?
On our way.
They're on their way. Meanwhile, Andy.
Andrew Langlois, 9 Tower Drive. I'd like to first thank you for doing the modeling, because we haven't done this in the past, and particularly when we went through the issue with the intermediate school, many years ago. I also would like to point out that if we did a non-debt scenario, we would have to include in that scenario the capital, and then we would have to deal with funding it with tax raises in each of the years when we needed to make the money available to do the job. So that leads to a very unstable tax situation for people who may be considering coming into the community. So it is the nature of doing something like this model to frame the parameters around which we're working the problem from the high to the low. I mean, I spent my whole career doing mergers and acquisitions and building a private company, and was used to doing these types of modeling. And I have to say that they've done a very, very good job with a complex problem. I had very little trouble understanding what went into it. I do think a baseline that considers doing no debt is possible, but you have to consider how you're going to finance the things that you need to do in the maintenance that is not built into that baseline scenario. So you're going to have to come up with the additional monies to do the roads, to do these different capital projects. And if there's $50 million worth of renovations to the whole campus, that's going to be spread out over 10 years, and you're going to have a fluctuating tax rate year to year in order to raise the money to do the work. Thank you.
Thanks, Andy. Mr. Ligori, have you got the microphone there?
Peter Ligori, Georgetown Road. So one person told me in town about the fact that I'm going to get a new car because I don't want to spend time putting tires on it. So that's one scenario. The other one is Mr. Holland's Opus had a budget meeting with the town. And he went straight at them. He says, you got to go back and do it again. And he said, we did. He goes, go back and do it again. He goes, Mr. Holland, we're doing the best we can. He goes, your best is not good enough. The other thing is knowing about the 5%. Is it compared to like a bridge loan after the 5-year cap that it adjusts to a higher rate?
I'm confused. Are you asking about the 5% interest expense?
Yes.
On the bond?
Is it interpreted as like a bridge loan to get going?
No, it's interpreted as either a 20-year loan or a 30-year loan.
Okay. My fear is that after the 5 years, who's controlling that?
Just a comment on the 5%. So as Michael said, current 30-year rates, and these are fixed rates for 30 years. For AAA municipal debt is around high 3s, 4%. If you look over the long-term average for AAA 30-year debt or 20-year debt, it's been close to 5%. And so that's why we picked 5%, because that's been the long-term rate. But that's a fixed rate over the entire term of the debt, and that's how it's reflected here.
Okay. I had one more point. I forgot. I think the narcotics are kicking in. So
Wish you a speedy recovery.
yeah,
Martin
thank you.
Moabeer. Yes, you do. Just turn that off, though. Thank you.
Martin Mohaber, 10 Hydridge Road. First of all, thank you for doing this painstaking modeling. I haven't done stuff like this myself. I don't envy you at all. And thank you for having this meeting at this time. It allowed me to at least feed my kids, so I appreciate that. A couple of things. I'm used to seeing in the municipal world debt a 20-year maturation period for debt. So when I see 30 years, that kind of scares me. I kind of think of it as someone who cannot afford a 30-year mortgage, they get a 40-year mortgage so that it helps them lower their monthly payments. The 30 years allows you to borrow more money, but it comes at a cost. So
Yep.
I would really hope that we exercise some kind of financial discipline and find money somewhere else as opposed to looking at the 30-year option. So that's just a comment there. Rowan said something, and Rowan, maybe I'm misconstruing what you said, but you said something here that perhaps to me is the most important thing that I've heard tonight, and that is, it sounds like what you said is that at the end of the day, it's less about the debt service that's going to really kind of have an impact on our taxes, and it's more about basically the operating budget or the gross budgets. Did I hear that correct?
Well, if you look over the life of this projected model, and you look at the taxes that are calculated, and you look at the fact that, and this is true, that the tax on a median assessed value house roughly doubles over 20 years. What's driving that is the compounded impact of growth in the operating and to some extent the annual capital tax levy budget. The impact on debt is capped at 10% because it's the debt service, and that debt service actually goes down over time. So at the end of 20 years, it's closer, you can look in the models, closer to 4 or 5%. So it's not the debt service that's the primary driver of the doubling in taxes.
Yeah, well, when I hear that, I mean, and I think that that's true. I get that. So what really scares me is, I mean, what percentage of the overall budget is to schools?
About 2/3.
Is it that low, or is it more like, when I was there, it was like 80% or so?
2/3. School is about 2/3 of the total town budget.
Okay. What? The thing that gets me is that if that's the case, and tell me if this is still the case, there was when I sat in the Board of Selectmen, there was a minimum, I forget what it was called. Was it the minimum budget requirement or minimum budget requirement for the
MBR,
schools?
yeah.
MBR. Is that still in place?
Yeah.
So basically what that is that you cannot decrease the school's budget year after year. And so that scares me, that at the end of the day, if our school's budget is going up by 4.6% or whatever it is, and at the end of the day, that's the driver in our taxes, we've got to focus there. I realize this is not the preview of this committee, but it's really the budget of the schools that we really have to keep an eye on. So your comment was a kind of an eye-opener there as well. I'm looking at page.
Martin, just a clarification, the school budget is 77%.
That's what I thought. When I was there, it was about
Overall town
78%. So yeah, so it's still very high. So again, it's that school budget that we've got to get our hands over and ensure that, because that increase will compound year after year after year. Page 19 that talks about the major capital expenditures. We're in an inflationary period, right? Duh. And any building that we do right now, there's that baked-in cost of inflation. So my hope is that we will prioritize the school over some of these other expenditures that I see here. I still don't understand what a $10 million infrastructure expenditure really is. $6 million's already
It's
been
the
approved.
annex, it's repairs to town hall, it's other things that I don't fully understand it myself. It's just a number that town hall is working with and they need to refine.
Well, if I had my say, I hope that we prioritize the school first, then kind of beautifying the town, for lack of a better phrase, because there is inflation now. And, you guys may know this, but the school's in flux. The superintendent retires at the end of this year. 2 of the principals of the middle school and the intermediate school are leaving. I mean, I would love to have those new leaders be involved in the decision as to what needs to happen with the schools there. But I really do hope that the focus is on the school first, the town second. I believe that's about it. Thank you again.
Thanks, Martin. Please.
Hi, good evening. Annalise Ferrara. So I understand that you don't promote and you don't approve of the 110 million, but has anyone looked into the cost of demolition and removal of the waste and the environmental cost on top of the 110, or does the 110 include all of those costs as well?
I don't believe that 110 ever contemplated the costs associated with demolition, which
Well, what-
makes it was unworkable on a lot of different ways.
Exactly,
That's one of
but I
them.
mean, if you add that cost as well, it would be totally impossible
Yeah.
to do that.
And there
Okay.
would have been environmental issues there too.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Well, Lisa, Jasmine, hold on. Let's get people who still haven't spoken yet, please. Could you please, yeah, so everybody online. No, it's online, and Netflix is watching tonight because they might want to option this meeting. Name and address, please.
Oh, Susan Barron, Old Tide Road.
Thank you.
One question, is the capital improvement forecast going to change? Will that number change?
Very likely it will.
Okay. What, as a person who does not have skin in the game presently in the schools, all right, I think it's important that we need to talk about sort of tightening our belts a little bit, where the town has to sort of look at our operating costs and how things are managed. And like when you renovate your house and they come in and they say it'll cost you $200,000 to renovate and da-da-da-da, and you say, well, I'm going to do it in stages. We need to do stages there. We also need to tighten our belts. It's a very, very, very scary time. And the cost, I mean, listen, I'm flipping out every day. I barely get out of bed because of what's going on. But I do think there's one thing that stands out at me, this one thing in the operating, in the capital thing, and it's the sidewalk project. Because I feel that that's a big expense, and it puts a burden on the people who live on the road to maintain it. And when you plow, which you all know, your driveways get blocked, the roads get blocked, and it's up to then that homeowner to then clean up that. And that's an unnecessary burden. And we really do, and I get back to, we really do have to tighten our belts. We've got to figure out how we can cut here, and maybe someone will work an hour more and we'll pay a little more there so we don't have to have a person here. But we need maybe, I don't know if you have a management consulting firm, but we could, if we don't, we certainly need one. But I do want to thank you for all the work that you've done. It's overwhelming, but it's useful. So thank you.
Thank you, Susan.
Okay.
Appreciate it.
But tighten our belt.
Other questions from people who have not yet spoken? Then we're, Jasmine, going up. And for the record, please reintroduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Jasmine. I live at 14 Oldfield. So I have a question. I know that the budget discussion or the renovations conversation have been going on for about 20 years, give or take. Can someone explain why it has taken so long to make this kind of decision? Or I guess, and I guess like, are we going to see the same thing? I hope not, but I'm just trying to figure out, because there are a lot of new families, and so we want to make the best decisions for our families, and we're going to be the one impacted by it because we have little kids, and the renovation is going to impact us. And so I'm trying to understand, what were the proposals before, if any, and why were we rejecting them? Just like overview, because it's been going on for 20 years. So why didn't we piecemeal them at any given time in this long discussion?
Yeah, I think this is a Roan question.
I've been on the Board of Finance since for 8 years now, so that's why I'm kind of being asked to talk about history. So the schools have traditionally done this hadn't gone back 20 years, at least. Well, I don't go, every 10 years, the schools do a 10-year facility study and look at what they think they need to do for basically capital expenditures for the next 10 years. So in 2017, that period came up, and they hired a firm called Silver Petrocelli that did basically a review of all the school facilities, came up with a very detailed list of things that they recommended be done at different points over the next 10 years. And that was the 10-year capital study. As part of that, they also looked at what the capital impact would be from trying to consolidate from four schools down to 3 schools that was alluded to. And not a lot came out of, and the numbers roughly were that the schools needed to spend about $70 million over the next 10 years. Rather than embrace that in total, certain projects were pursued over the next few years, but there wasn't a grand plan, and I can't give you a really good explanation for exactly all the reasons why. But the question about the future of investment program for the schools also got commingled with what should we be doing with certain other town facilities. And so in, let me get my years straight, 2019, a committee was formed called the Facilities Optimization Committee. And that was consisted of a group of people from the Board of Ed, the Board of Finance, the first select woman from the Building Committee, from planning, assorted groups that looked overall at facilities. It was then, because of COVID, had a bit of a hiatus, then hired a consultant, and you heard the allusion about alluding to the consulting expenses and studies that have been accumulated. They hired a firm called Tecton. Tecton looked at a series of scenarios and emerged out of that, 8 or 9 different ones. But that was the genesis of the idea of potentially building a new middle school or renovating as new the middle school. That committee then handed off its work to the Board of Ed, who ultimately had to make a decision on what to do. The Board of Ed formed a committee to come up with a recommendation, and that's what they came up with in the spring of last year, which was the $110 million proposal for the middle school that was alluded to. When the cost of although there wasn't a lot of detailed analysis, there was concern about the cost that was proposed. And I think that's one of the reasons why the Board of Ed hired Colliers to look at some other alternatives. And I believe the Colliers' work went back to look at a lot of the Silver Petrocelli work that was done as sort of a checklist against what needed to be done for the schools, as well as doing specific work for the middle school proposal. So that's the most concise, that's sort of the best kind of summary of the history on where we are with kind of the different studies that have looked at facilities and where we've been. It doesn't go back quite 20 years, but it does go back about 7 years, where there was a stake in the ground with the Silver Petrocelli study on school facilities.
Thank you for that. And can I ask you, is there an option for our town to allocate funds for future expenses for the school like this? Or is it, I guess, like, if I budget this 100 million out in the last 20 years, if we had created some sort of reserve, or does it not work like that? I don't understand.
The numbers would be huge. I think the town budget is contemplating a sinking fund, which is kind of what you're talking about, for fire trucks,
Okay.
which is a much smaller purchase price.
Okay. And so I guess for me, the last thing I would like to say, I know I'm a little out of time, but I had reviewed a similar case study to a town not in Weston, but in nearby Glen Ridge in New Jersey. It's 30 minutes away from New York. I've been looking at other towns in New York City, around New York City. Similarly, it has a roughly 8,000 people, similar size in housing. Their taxes are a little higher, and they were able to, in the last 5 years, approve a build of renovate a new elementary school, and fix up their other elementary school. They had an addition due to COVID influx, for $28 million. And so I guess when we look at certain towns and certain things like that, what I would like the Board of Education to kind of break down is, in these different scenarios, what are we getting? Like, what are we giving up from one scenario to another versus like 107 versus 105? I would like a concise sort of like, are we just fixing the basics where it won't break, and then we have to think of other things, because as technology gets more involved, as we have to do certain things, maybe for security and other things, are we looking at the future as well as prioritizing what needs to be fixed now so that we don't have to spend more money down the road? And I think that other towns have been doing it a little cheaper. New Canaan is thinking of building a new elementary school as well. And I don't know if they're budgeting that much money for similarly. I know we're not the same town, but it would be nice to see what are we spending, so that we can choose the options. And will we have the ability to see the different options when it's presented, like in a group forum, or will it kind of be chosen and then we just vote at the end?
I think that's going to be up to the Board of Ed, but historically, the last time they went through this exercise a couple years ago with Tecton, they showed the community a couple of choices. By the way, a little closer to home, if you go to, I think it's Trumbull, right? Trumbull's public school system, they just went through this exercise of building an actual middle school, got it all approved, and their website has a lot of rich information in there. Yeah, there are differences in the town, but I was interested in looking at their process.
Okay.
Thank you, Jasmine.
Do we know how much Trumbull spent?
Yeah, it was north of $100 million.
Okay.
But I think that they got a really good deal from the legislature and got a lot more reimbursement than we're thinking that we can get. So there are some big differences. Are there other questions from people who have not? I can. Yeah. Just.
Years ago, too, when we looked at this, we were in a low interest rate environment. It made sense that if we'd done it then, our interest rate would have been under 3%.
Just a little bit of history to compare what was done for the intermediate school versus what we're contemplating in the forecast model. This dotted red line is what the debt service ratio was for the town from 2005 to 2024. And I think we went to market with the debt, it was about 2007, thereabouts? Yeah. 2000, there were three different issues, but the point is that there was a period of time when no one had done any kind of modeling. We had a debt service ratio north of 12. And the scenarios that, we didn't model in the 10% because we didn't want to exhaust our excess debt capacity. But years 1 through 20 in the forecast for the 8% and the 9%, you can see the debt service ratio is well below over the full 20 years, what we've previously done. So what we're modeling out from a debt service point of view is far more conservative. That's what the Collier's plan is about, but yeah. No, I'm not mocking you. I'm saying I agree. It's a simple fix. Custodians, yeah. All right. Let's keep it focused up here, guys. Yeah.
Well, I think that there, at times, people are talking about the Collier's plan as being, bare bones, but we've historically spent about $1 million a year in capital, in the annual capital budget on the schools, or less. And if we did the Collier's plan, which was $50 million over 10 years, that's $5 million a year. That's 5 times what we have invested over the last 10 years in the schools. So there may be other things that are needed, but understand that, dealing with things like sinks is a very different proposition with that level of spending compared to where we've been. So.
The debt associated with the intermediate school created a crowding out problem. That's what that red dotted line is telling you, is that a really big chunk of the budget for a long time was going to debt service. And it crowded out the kind of simple maintenance that you're talking about, Susan.
Well, because nobody did this kind of modeling before.
Yeah.
That's one. And so, I would like to thank you all, because I have some sense of what an enormous amount of work this is. Board today had a meeting where we all were able to speak, and then they said, we're now going to vote. And we were all giving our opinions. This is spring.
Oh, you're talking about last April? Yeah, I was here at that meeting.
What we had to say.
Yeah.
And then they turned and said, well, we're going to vote now. So we all sat there, giving our opinions, pouring out our hearts, and it didn't matter because they voted to do it. And then it was like, if they would open the doors to let us in, some of us older people have some experience, The other thing is, we don't take out that 77% of our taxes are not spent on us. Correct. And you need to keep us.
Here, here. Other questions? All right. If there are no other questions, we're coming up on 10 o'clock. We've been here 2 hours. It's been a robust discussion. I want to thank all of you for attending. I'd like to thank everybody who's online, who's been watching, and those of you who will watch the recording. Thank my colleagues Chris, Roan, and the entire Board of Finance. Meeting is adjourned, and make sure you tune in for all the budget review stuff coming up. Thanks, everybody. Hi.